Sitting with us today is Mr. Ajit Chak, resident editor of Daily World newspaper and TV channels. And Mr. Ajit, I would like to have your comments on one of the breaking news story of today, in which the Supreme Court has asked the central government to come up with certain mechanisms to deal with complaints against media in general and press and TV channels in particular. What are your views on this rather historic kind of a decision made by the Supreme Court today?
I think it's an excellent idea. There should be a mechanism to deal with complaints against radio and TV channels so that you can smoothen and streamline the process, rather than putting it into the general system that it takes 20 years to deal with the complaint, going through the litigation process or whatever. On the other hand, also there's a flip side to it. The flip side is, this should not be used as an excuse by the central government to try and muzzle the media or try and put restraints and fetters in the media or impose some kind of press censorship. You see, the central government has to be extremely careful and extremely moral while coming up with this rule, law, mechanism, or whatever they want to set in place to deal with the press. Because the basic foundation of our democracy is a free press. When Nehru came up with the freedom of press, the Press Act and whatever, and he decided to give journalists certain rights, it was because he wanted to create an opposition to the government in power, to the party in power, because at that time there was no opposition to Nehru in the country. So he created a powerful media to ensure that there will be somebody to speak against him and somebody to represent the masses. Now the media on the other hand should also, take care of its own systems. The media should regulate itself, the media should police itself also internally to ensure that they don't go overboard, that sections of the media do not, cross that fine line. So where criticism turns into, say, slander or libel.
Quite correct. Now, would you say, in your opinion, as a journalist who has been in the field for close to 20 years, does the media often transgress this line? Is there a real necessity for legislation or mechanisms to be developed in this regard? And could it not work both ways? That it could in many ways negate the very ethos of the Press Act itself, because when you bring the media under the purview or mechanisms which will go into complaints against them, in a way that is also, whichever is the authority which is going to investigate that complaint, presumably it will be a government authority. Now, by virtue of becoming an authority like this, it will de facto amount to censorship or curtailment or muzzling of the press and media. Do you see that as a threat?
That's a worst case scenario what we're getting into. See, we already have an institution that takes care of complaints against the press, and that's the Press Council.
So where is the need then for another this thing?
We already have a law that is taking care of defamation. We already have a law that is taking care of slander.
So we already have all these laws, and it has been said at many places, and rightly so, that what India lacks is not legislation. There is a plethora of legislation on practically every single field that you can think of, and many which you can't think of also. Do we really need another set of legislation or another kind of mechanism to look into this?
Well, what I feel the spirit of what the court is trying to say is that they're directing the central government to come up with a process that deals with these quickly, so that parties don't have to wait for years and years and years and go through the entire cumbersome process of litigation to get redressal to their grievances. And you also asked me, has there been areas where the media has transgressed its limits across the fine line? Well, you see, if you look at sting operations, there was a time when there used to be a lot of sting operations. Now, sting operations is a very grey area. We can't say whether they're crossing the fine line or they're not crossing the fine line, or they're actually doing something that is good for journalism or good for the country in that. That is something that needs to be looked at very carefully. Then there's another area you have to look at, you know. There have been incidences where journalists have tried to blackmail officials, blackmail politicians, and some journalists have unfortunately even been arrested for these things. So the media has to also police itself. Editors have to look at their own staff and say, this guy is not doing the right thing. And why let it build up to such an issue where you get into a conflict situation with somebody and he actually goes and complains against you to the government or the press council and you're taken to court for it? So the thing is that on one hand you have the media which should look at itself, police itself, take care of its own people. On the other hand, you have the person who's aggrieved, and on the third hand, you have the government itself, you know, who has to also handle both complaints and who has to also handle the media.
Thank
So
you very
it's
much,
a tricky
Mr.
situation.
Ajit. I think you have analyzed it very
Thank you
comprehensively
so much.
and let us await developments.